Experience.
So if you are looking for a language tutor, you want to practice your language skills, especially if you don't live in the country where the country you're learning is spoken, or if you're traveling a lot like I am, then I recommend you go down to the description below the video and check out a link there for italki or italki, because that is a service I have used an awful lot over the last few years, as many of you know who are regular viewers to the channel. And there you're going to find tens of thousands of language tutors, and you can have classes with them, one-on-one individual classes via Skype. You don't have to meet them in person, and you can do all the payments online, and it's something that I have used regularly over the last few years to learn my languages. And of course you get a special discount if you go through my link. There is some starter credit of $10 towards your first lesson, so go check out the link to italki or italki, depending on which way you want to pronounce it. Всем привет, salut, and welcome to this second episode of the Zara Experience podcast with me, Connor Klein. I'm delighted to have you back here. Today I'm speaking to you from a very, very nice park called l'Abbaye de la Cambre in Brussels, in Belgium. And there's a particular reason why I chose this location to have the second episode of the podcast. Unfortunately, you can't see it if you're listening to this just in the audio on the podcast version, but if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll be able to see this beautiful park. It's one of my favorite places in Brussels. I actually come here kind of to take a run or just to have a stroll. It's right in the city centre, a little bit of an oasis of calm here in a big European capital. And in today's episode of the podcast, I'm going to discuss my own language learning journey and how it can inspire and help you and motivate you to learn lots of languages. And this city is actually important to that story because I actually lived in Brussels for a few years. But to get started into the podcast and to explain my background, my name is Connor Klein. You might be able to detect that that is a Irish name. So I was born in Ireland, in Galway on the west coast of Ireland. And you probably, if you're listening to this, especially on the podcast version, you will notice that I don't have a particularly Irish accent when I speak. I've lost that Irish brogue to a certain extent, unfortunately. A lot of people find it charming. And that's because I've lived in lots of countries since being born and growing up in Ireland. So you can probably hear different influences in my accent. I lived in the US for a while, also in France, in Belgium here, in Germany, in Italy, in France. If I haven't said France already, the Netherlands was the other one. And recently I was spending a lot of time, as probably a lot of you know, and this is probably why you're watching this video, I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, so countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Romania, Moldova, and occasionally I've been in Poland and in Russia, the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. So if you've been watching this channel before I started to focus on Eastern Europe, you will have seen that I did a lot of videos about learning languages and being a polyglot. Now, polyglot is someone who just basically means someone who speaks lots of languages. It's not very it may sound like a very elitist term, but that's basically what it describes. And I actually started out in Ireland, a country which of course is not known for its linguistic prowess. I mean, we don't have a very good reputation like the same in the United Kingdom or in America for learning foreign languages. And I was definitely a very good example of that, because in high school, my three worst results in my high school final exams, the state exams, were actually in the languages. So those three languages I had to learn, like English, obviously it's my native tongue, Irish, because that's the official language of the country of Ireland. It's not English with an Irish accent. It's a completely different language from the Celtic family of languages. And I don't really think it's that hard to learn, but it is completely different to English. And then I had French. That was my foreign language in that sense. And they were my worst three subjects. I really couldn't master pronunciation. Obviously, English is my native tongue, so that's not an issue. But in French, for example, I could not get the pronunciation down at all. And I just really struggled. Vocabulary, grammar terms. I actually found it really boring when I was in high school. Like, languages were something that I just felt like they're not for me. They're from other people in the class who seem to get the good results, right? Because at the time I equated being a good student with being a good learner of languages, and it's only later on that I've realized that's not always the case, and in fact it's actually maybe never really the case if you look at people who actually go on to learn lots of languages versus people who are students of languages and get really good results in those high school exams in particular. So I was there and I just thought language is not for me. They're my worst results. I was really good at things like physics, chemistry, mathematics. I got like top grades and all those kind of things. Also accountancy, so anything with numbers it seemed like I got a good result on. So I actually then studied law, which of course involves language because you got to speak it, you got to read all the time. Admittedly, it was in English. I did have legal French at university, but I really was like the worst student in the class again. And actually only passed my second year French exams. We had legal French, was very specialized, and I couldn't even speak French, so learning legal terminology was obviously really difficult for me. And I remember I was basically just passed out of sympathy because I agreed to go on a language exchange in my third year, spend the entire year in France and actually learn some French. So the teacher was like, okay, fine, I'll just give you a passing grade just so you can go to France and actually learn the language. So I arrived in France to do this university exchange. The exchange program in Europe is called Erasmus, and it was definitely a really transformative year for me because, you know, I had never lived in a foreign culture and had to adapt to it, so it was really a challenge in the beginning. I could not, and this I'm not joking, I could not order a sandwich on the train from Paris to the city I was actually spending the year on the exchange program in. I had to point, I had to grunt because I just didn't even know. I tried to say like, can I have whatever, a sandwich please, and the guy didn't understand me. This is the bottom line, so I had to point at it and grunt. That's how terrible my level of French was. And remember, I've had this for 5 years in high school, followed by 2 years in university where I'm supposed to be learning legal French to be a lawyer in French, and I cannot even order a sandwich. So any notion that you have that people who learn lots of languages in general are talented or have some special like gene for learning languages, well, I don't believe it exists, but if it does, I certainly wasn't blessed with it because I started at the bottom, the worst student. And during that year in France, I mean, I basically spent the first, I would say, month to 2 months completely mute. I couldn't partake in any of the conversations that everyone else was having around me because, I just didn't understand anything and I couldn't say anything over extremely basic. So my friend, I had a friend who was with me there, I had several friends who were with me, but one in particular, he actually interpreted for me a lot, so I didn't end up completely left out. But obviously, he couldn't do that. They couldn't do simultaneous interpretation for me every day, 24 hours a day. So basically, I was very isolated because I couldn't communicate with people. Of course, some people who were other foreign students spoke English, but the region was in France. People did not speak very much English. I did have other English speakers on. We were staying in these dorms, in these residences. Not really dorms, they were like, because we had our own rooms, but we were staying in this residence, and there were, of course, other foreign students on my floor, so I was able to communicate with them using English when I first arrived. But over the year, basically, I managed to adapt and survive, and I got to a really basic level in French, and I became a lot more confident, but it still wasn't very good, right? And this is after living in the country for 1 year. Well, at this stage, maybe about 10 months, the academic year. And I even went to the south of, I'd gone on a little bit of a traveling trip, and I arrived back in France on my own. I said, okay, now I'm gonna spend the summer here, and I think I have enough French to at least be able to communicate on a very basic level with people, like high beginner probably was my level at the time, maybe low intermediate, just about that. And a chance occurrence then happened. I was in Cannes, which is very famous for the film festival in the south of France. I went there on a day trip, and there was a guy who was sitting with a girl. We were sitting on a terrace. Beautiful day. It's the south of France. You can imagine the seaside Cannes, and he was there, and he was ordering in French, talking in some language. I figured out it was German from listening to it with the girl he was with. And then he turned to me and he said, hello, are you British? And he had a slight accent, German accent in English when he addressed me. And we started to chat, and he was telling me that he had actually just come from Spain that morning where he spoke in Spanish, and then he was going to Italy in the evening where he was going to speak in Italian, and he was speaking to his girlfriend in German, and he was ordering in French and speaking English to me. So I was like, man, that's like 5 languages. And he said, yeah, I'm a polyglot actually. So I'm just someone who speaks lots of language. And he was explaining to me that he had played table tennis at a high level when he was younger, and he also had the matches, the tournaments in the different countries around Europe. So he was really fascinated by languages, because when he would go and play, he would encounter the different people who speak the different languages across Europe as he went to play in the tournaments for the German national team, if I remember correctly. So he was like, constantly moving around throughout Europe, and he had a need and a motivation. And but I was just completely taken aback, because I'd never met anyone who spoke more than maybe 2 or 3 languages. This guy spoke 5, right? I think he may even spoke more than that, maybe it was 6. And I'd never even heard of this word polyglot and understood what it meant. But I mean, basically it just means someone who speaks lots of language. I do have an article on my website that I'm going to link in the description below this in YouTube, and also put in the show notes to the podcast, where I actually go into depth of what, how many languages is someone a polyglot, the different types of categories, and all that kind of nerdy stuff. So if you really want to geek out on this, then you can go check that out. I'm going to link it below in the show notes and in the description in YouTube here. And so I said to him, like, well, do you spend all your time studying? Because like to speak that number of languages is like insane for me. And he was like, actually, no, I'm just kind of like motivated. I'm really curious because I get to use them a lot, and I want to be able to speak in French in France, and in Italian in Italy. So I read about the grammar, and I studied it a little bit, but actually I just kind of talk to people a lot, and I read a lot in the different languages. I watch the TV, because here in the time in Germany, I guess you had a lot of foreign TV stations, so I can kind of watch the news or watch a documentary in French, and it's pretty easy for me. So I found this like amazing. I was like, man, this is like really just something that astounds me, because growing up in Ireland where people spoke English and Irish and maybe one other foreign language, this was like something I'd never encountered, even on my year as an exchange student. So I came back from that meeting, and I was working for the summer in Nice, and it was really made me a lot more curious about the other languages that we hear, because we were very close to Italy, so there were a lot of Italians that come into the restaurant. I worked as a waiter for the summer to get some money to go traveling at the end. I went around Corsica, which is a really beautiful island, so if you get the chance, go there. And I took that trip, and I learned a lot of French, of course, over the summer, because I was having to deal with the public. I was a waiter, so I had to, of course, serve people and wait the tables and talk to the customers, and I started to get exposed to Italian. I take a little trip there, so I was really like curious about Italian. And having met this guy who was a polyglot, it really kind of made me think. Right, over the last year, I didn't really have language classes very much. I did have them a little bit at university, and I sucked at them. I did the exams. I think I failed them all. So again, another example where I sucked as a student, and I started to think, well, this guy wasn't taking exams, right? I mean, he was just learning because he was really excited, and he enjoyed it, and he was like reading lots in the different languages, watching TV, and just talking to people. So it seemed like he was able to master all these languages. And the people who were getting the high grades in the class, they would do well in that exam, and they would be able to speak to people obviously better than me outside, but they weren't people who were like speaking 4, 5, 6 languages. So I thought, this guy is onto something. And after I spent that summer, I did improve, because I obviously had a lot of contact with the language. I traveled around in Corsica on my own for the week, and I had a great time there, and I did, really talk to a lot of people, and also at my job as a waiter, that had happened. So I came back to finish my law studies in Ireland, and I started to get really curious about finding some sort of alternative method. And I remember I went to the local bookshop, and they had the kind of classical language books there, and none of them really inspired me, because it seemed like I was just going to learn lots of grammar and vocabulary, and it was the same old that I've been seeing in class, and I still can't pronounce things properly, so this isn't going to help me be any different, right, in terms of a learning experience. And there was one course that kind of caught my eye, because the cover to it had these words like something like no memorization, no homework. I think they were the 2 things that caught my eye, and they really appealed to me, because having followed having followed that kind of like rigid classroom regime at school, it had been absolutely ineffective to teach me languages. So I was like, I'm willing to try anything else at this stage. But it was actually a course from Michel Thomas. I'll link this below as well, of course, in the description to the YouTube video and the show notes to the podcast, so you can go take a look. Michel Thomas was originally from, I think he was from modern-day Poland. He may have been born in Łódź, and he'd grown up in Germany a little bit, in Breslau at the time. I think that's Wrocław today, if I'm not mistaken, in Poland. And then he had this incredible life story. You know, during the Second World War, he was Jewish, and he was living in France. And of course, you had the Nazi Germany invaded France, and you had the Vichy government, the puppet government, in the part that he was, and he had all these. He even, he was interrogated, and he had to pretend he didn't understand German, even though, of course, he spoke fluent German, to avoid being executed by the Nazi regime, or the pro-Nazi regime where he was. And after the war, he had even testified at the trial of a leading Nazi. So he had this incredible life story, and then afterwards he had opened a language school in California, in LA, and became this big celebrity teacher to a lot of stars. So he had this course, and it seemed very different, and I remember he had this kind of crackly voice on the old recording, and it was kind of imperfect, but it really helped me get the basics down in terms of learning how to open conversations. And I was really hooked in this. I think I bought it in several languages. I think he had it in like German, Spanish, Italian, French, and Italian, I think, at the time. So I bought them in. I may have bought, in the space of a few months, actually bought them in all of them, even though I wasn't learning all the languages. I was just like so excited. And I was motivated to learn Italian because I'd had this great trip to Italy, and I was really like, yeah, I want to live in Italy for at least 1 year of my life. I'm not sure how I'm going to do it at the time, but I was really determined to at least start on that path. So I bought the course, and I listened to it, and I remember some of my family was making fun of me because I was like listening to it when it was dark and repeating the sentences and building up the structures, and not memorizing and doing anything, or being in a classroom environment, right? The traditional learning approach. And they were kind of making fun of me for doing this kind of crazy thing, like it seemed insane to them. And then I think it was like the following year, I went to study in the Netherlands, and I invited an Italian girl out on a date, and it was kind of funny. I had a 20-minute conversation only in Italian, and I can remember I had just taken the Michel Thomas like 8-hour course up until now, like the audio course, and that's all the Italian I had, right? And it was exhausting, but I lasted 20 minutes in Italian, and I later dated this girl. We went out together for a couple of years, so then obviously my Italian improved dramatically afterwards because I had an Italian girlfriend. And that's again part of the philosophy, I guess, to learning languages. I had a high motivation and a lot of exposure to language when you have obviously a relationship, an intimate relationship with someone. But that just shows like this alternative allowed me to have a 20-minute conversation. Remember when I was telling you about French and my experience? I had 5 years at school and 2 years at university. I couldn't order a sandwich on the first day. I might have a 20-minute conversation. I was living in France in that Erasmus year, and it was months before I had a 20-minute conversation with anyone. And to have a one-on-one in Italian was like, obviously, as I said, tiring. It wasn't very easy. I was struggling at parts, but I got through it. And it obviously it made a good impression, right? Because I ended up in a relationship as a result. So this really, for me, meant I could never go back to like traditional language learning after that. So I continued. I obviously learned Italian. I actually lived in Italy. I achieved my goal. I went to study at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS, which is their School of Advanced International Studies. And they actually had a campus in Bologna in Italy. So I actually went for the first year there and studied in Italy, got to live, had probably the best year of my life, definitely my university life. It was just amazing living in northern Italy, eating just incredible food, the vibe at the time. It's a university city, Bologna, and it was just amazing. And I got really good Italian, obviously, having lived there and having had this base that I had learned from Michel Thomas, and also having a relationship with an Italian. And I spent the summer in Sardinia, if I remember correctly, which is another great thing. Beautiful island. If you ever get the chance, you should definitely go there and spend some time. It's really one of my favorite places in Italy. During the summer, just amazing beaches, and so I had this phenomenal experience. And at this stage, I speak okay French, I speak okay Italian, pretty good Italian. I took the exams as part of my master's and passed them in both of those languages, so I was like
officially competent finally. So we have 3 languages at this stage. And when I was there in Washington, I started to do things like, there was an Hispanic neighborhood basically 1 street away from where I lived, and I actually would go there and I started learning Spanish using the Michel Thomas. I had some classes also at university. I joined the class, but I didn't need it for credit or anything. It was just something that, was on offer. So I thought, why not take advantage and just, use that to improve another language at the same time. And I used to go like really regularly, like every second day to the Hispanic neighborhood. So these people were immigrants originally from Central America and primarily from El Salvador. And I would just speak in Spanish, open the conversation in Spanish. And I didn't speak very good Spanish, but I just went and did it, right? And some people were like, because my Spanish was obviously very basic, they didn't really want to entertain me, but I would say about 80% of the people in the neighborhood were happy to speak to me. They were either neutral or really happy to speak to me in Spanish, because they could see someone who wasn't a native Spanish speaker opening up, making an effort to learn their language, where they could probably empathize with that because they come to America and not speaking English and they had to struggle and learn it themselves. So they obviously respected that and were like, oh, this guy's in the same position, he's really trying to learn their language. And I remember I used to go to a taco stand every Sunday, the same one, one of these small vans, and I would like hang around and chat to the people there for like 10-15 minutes, and they were really delighted, because I was probably one of the few people who came by and actually bought a tacos and spoke in Spanish as a non-native speaker. And I also had my favorite cafe right near my university, and some of the people who worked there were El Salvadorian as well, and there was a French-speaking guy from West Africa, and then there were some Swahili-speaking guys that even taught me some Swahili. So I used to speak every day like French and Spanish, and so it was a bit like having a language class, but it was no extra effort. And what was really important was, like, I actually liked the people genuinely who I was chatting to every day in Spanish and French. And the Swahili I hadn't really learned, so they just teach me some terms, but we talk mainly in English. But even if I had to do everything in English, I would have spoken to those people and formed that friendship and relationship with them. But here I was doing it in French and Spanish, so like my French got really, really good. Not because I was taking classes, not because I was studying grammar, just because, every day, basically I was going to this cafe, and maybe the guy was working there every second day. So every second day I basically chatted for like half an hour in French. So I was like having a French class, and same for Spanish. I got up to a decent level. I didn't get I remember they tested me in Spanish from, obviously I'd start beginners, and there's a little bit of overlap, of course, with Italian and French, because they're from the same family of languages, the Romance family. So it wasn't like it was completely foreign to me in that sense. So I did have a little bit of a head start. But it's funny because they tested me at the school, right? So students, do I know the grammar and all this stuff? And they didn't pass me. I think they just about had me below the passing grade after, 2 semesters of the language, up to proficiency level, which was a very high, in theory, a high standard to have reached anyways. But I found it interesting because the people that they were passing in the exam had learned all these grammar rules and, the vocabulary that in reality they don't need when they're communicating 99% of the time. But when they would come to me at the cafe, they would struggle to have a natural conversation with the real native speakers. And for me, it was like, well, the goal of learning the language is actually to communicate with people, right? So they've been good students and they passed the exam, but they can't have a conversation and actually, or really engage in the subject matters that they really want to talk about naturally. So they may pass the exam, but are they going to continue to maintain the language? Are they going to improve? It's very unlikely, right? Because without that motivation, that curiosity, and those real, genuine relationships in the languages, it's just like it's too much work, right? You're not going to be studying grammar if you don't have the exam anymore, because that's the thing. They have a goal, pass the exam. It's useful for my career. I have to pass one language in order to get my final diploma. I didn't have that pressure. I was just like, I think this kicks ass, right? I mean, this excites me, this like challenge of like starting from position of a 5-year-old in terms of my ability in language and then gradually increasing, and that progress is addictive, and I'm talking to people, learning about their culture at the same time. Now I want to go visit their country. So the whole thing was really exciting.
So this is the end of the first part of this 2-part episode of the podcast. It's actually so long that I decided to split it into 2 parts now that we're doing the editing. As you can see, I'm no longer in Brussels. I'm actually in Odessa, or Odessa, on the Black Sea in Ukraine, just standing at the entrance to Park Shevchenko. You can see the statue of Taras Shevchenko there. If you're watching it on YouTube, if you're listening to it, well, you just have to imagine where I am. You should go below to the description of this video or the show notes if you're listening to this, and there I have a free video course for you guys, 3-part video course completely free. Just sign up by email and then you get that for completely free for you, which will help you. It's 3 of my secrets for learning languages, and then at the end of that there's the chance to join my premium course, Language Up Your Life. So until the second part of this episode next week, do svidaniya from Odessa, Ukraine.
SAR Experience.